very interested in Rabi because he really was a fabulous person. And in a sense, he's my scientific grandfather because I did my thesis and led my career really under the mentorship of Norman Ramsey. And Ramsey was one of the earliest graduate students in Rabi's laboratory. So he knew Rabi very well, talked with me about him. I met Rabi on many times. And he really is a fabulous personality. So that's what I'll be talking about. Isidor Isaac Rabi is his full name, and it's never used. He was known as I Rabi. And to everyone who knew him at all, he was simply Rabi. The one exception to that was his wife, Helen, who called him Rob. So he is sort of it's a bit of a title, like a royal title, where the king would sign his letter Charles. We would say Charles the King. He was universally recognized for having a special status. So the title is A Tale of Scientific Rags to Riches. And it really is, because he came totally ignorant, and through his own efforts, he ended up fabulously rich scientifically. He was always sort of well off, but never a really prosperous person. He wasn't that interested in making money. So here is his picture, sort of late in his career, at the height of his powers. One of his powers was he was the chair of the President's Science Advisory Committee. He was the advisor first to Eisenhower and then to Kennedy. In fact, he invented the post of scientific advisor to the president. He did that after the war, in which he was heavily involved in all sorts of affairs, and realized that things were just too complicated. The government was relying, each agency called in its own specialist and such. And he felt that the president needed one person that would be abreast of everything that he could consult with. And for that purpose, he designed what became PCAST, the President's Science Advisory Committee. PCAST had the best scientists in the country on it. I mean, Ed Purcell was on it, Ed Land was on it too, and others. And it had an extremely good reputation. It provided what the president needed, which was excellent information about science. Rabi was very clear about the role of a scientific advisor, which is just to give information and in no way to pass judgment or offer other opinions. He was aware that presidents had many things to consider that you didn't know about. So one never came back to the president and tried to argue a case when it didn't deserve that. Anyway, he was the advisory committee 56 to 57. It continued through Kennedy's administration and stopped in the middle of Nixon's. And the reason was there was so much anti-war protest centered at universities that he just got angry. He gave them a sort of special place on his enemies list, declared the PCAST an enemy, and just abolished it. It was a terrible act. Okay. As you can see, the discussion lends itself to hyperbole and overstatement. I've tried to avoid that, but in the sense of complete clarity, here are the sources for this. Jeremy Bernstein wrote 2 superb articles in the New Yorker in 1975, based on interviews with Rabi. Bernstein himself was a theoretical physicist and very knowledgeable. In addition to that, there's a book on Rabi by John Rigdon. When I read the book, it sounded very much like Rabi. He really got the tone and descriptions down right. I asked him about that, and he said, well, actually, I wrote Rabi's autobiography. He just made a series of visits to Rabi's apartment, and Rabi dictated things to him, and he essentially wrote used that verbatim material in the book. One reason that he had to do that is that Rabi did not like to write himself. He loved to talk, but he didn't care to write. So he got Rigdon to write for him. I knew Rabi in his later years, and actually in the earlier years too, but in the later years, we became somewhat open with each other. And whenever we went to New York City, we would stop and visit the Rabis, who lived on Riverside Drive in a lovely apartment, but not a Trump Tower kind of place. And somehow Ramsey's name got dropped, the why. I had many conversations with Norman Ramsey. After I'd finished my thesis, and later on when I was well established at MIT, we traveled many places together and spent lots of time together, and he just loved to tell stories about Rabi, and they were endless. Furthermore, I knew many of Rabi's students, and they just loved to talk about him. He was a good conversation point. So that's what's behind me, and this is what they call full disclosure and utter transparency. Okay. Rabi's early years were a familiar story. He emigrated to the United States, or immigrated actually to the United States in, excuse me, I'm just trying to close off these portraits on the blocking my view. I want to imagine your view too. Yeah, okay. He was born in 1898 in a small town in what is now Poland, but was then called Silesia. It's one of these little European countries which just got swallowed up. Anyway, they left. Rabi, his parents, and that was it. After they were in the US, there was a sister born to him. And they settled in New York City on the Lower East Side, which is a well-known, Rabi called it as a Jewish ghetto. Very densely populated place. Most of the people spoke English poorly, at least the older ones did. They lived often in tenement conditions. The Rabis were somewhat different. First of all, they did not speak German nor Russian, which were the two most common languages outside of English and in that ghetto. They spoke Yiddish. His parents were Jewish, which meant Orthodox Jewish, and at home they spoke Yiddish, and in fact the only language that Rabi knew was Yiddish. He learned English on the streets. He was a very quick learner and also a natural leader, so there was lots of social interactions. As far as money goes, they really weren't seriously impoverished, but they were never particularly wealthy. They always had to watch money, but they were very generous about that. One of the themes which comes through Rabi's narrative is that his parents were always very supportive to him. And looking back, he feels that he was very unsupportive to them. In fact, that he gave them a very hard time and is very regretful that he wasn't nicer to his parents. Anyway, his father had a little grocery store. In 1908, they moved to Brownsville in Brooklyn because there would be more business for the store. It was a rather different atmosphere. It was more of a country atmosphere there. However, he made a great discovery. He read early and he read avariciously. There were many books at home, but they were all in Yiddish. And he went through all his own Yiddish books. He saw a boy with an English book and asked about it, and the guy said he got it from the library. Rabbi knew nothing about libraries, but he went, and that was a revelation for him. And he spent much of his early years in the library. This was not comfortable for the parents. His father wanted him to be spending more time in the synagogue, but Rabbi was very firm and abrasive and just went to the library on weekends, every weekend, and just read everything in sight. He just started at the beginning of the alphabet and worked through the library as well as he could. And that changed his life. Now, when it was time to go to high school, there was one of the best high schools in the city nearby. But he decided not to go to it. There were a couple of reasons that he talked about. He said, first of all, that everyone in the high school was Jewish and he wanted to meet some other people. Another reason is that he had developed lots of hobbies in electricity and doing mechanical things. And he thought it would be interesting to learn some of the mechanical arts. So he really went to a vocational high school, the manual training high school, in 1916. It's the last place in the world I would have thought for a person like that. But Rabbi was very purposeful in what he did. And actually, it turned out to work out well. The high school was really rather tough. They gave the normal high school curriculum and then added a few hours of manual work every day. But he loved the place. There were some teachers he particularly loved. Math teacher he loved, and the chemistry teacher he loved. The physics teacher was the only PhD on the faculty, but he thought he was terrible. So he came out of the school with sort of a penchant towards math and chemistry and an aversion to physics. In his final year, everyone took the Regents examinations. Turned out Rabbi had the state's highest score of all things in history. In all his reading, he read a lot of history. And in fact, in his old age, he was really deeply, not obsessed by, but very interested in classical history. So he was ready to really make good use of college or university, except that there was very little money. However, by virtue of his tremendous performance on the Regents exams, he got a Regents scholarship, which let him go to any public college or university in the state. Now, the college for him normally to go to would have been Columbia University. It's in the city, it's a great university, very broad and very private. But in any case, he didn't want to go there. Where he wanted to go to was to, oh yeah, here are a few pictures of him at that age when he graduated. Some of the things he did. He did what I did at that age, and lots of physicists do at that age, sort of technical hobbies. He was, a radio operator and a photographer, and he always needed money. And that summer before going to college, he worked as a salesman at Macy's. By that point, his character really was fully formed. I think it was probably fully formed at birth. This means that he was very firm about religion. When he first came across Copernicus and learned a little bit about the Copernican theory, he went home and announced, "God is dead, I have Copernicus." This caused real distress in the family, but he was always very firm about that. And in later years, he would say that the God that I don't believe in is Jewish. He always felt strong Jewish identity and strong religious subversion. So in the college years, you would think that he would have a glorious time at the university where he could study just about anything. He went in 1916. In saying why he wanted to go, I think this is in Rigdon's book, I loved Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Finger Lakes, the situation of his novels. And on that rather unlikely criterion, he chose to go to Cornell. He had $100 a year Regents scholarship plus support from home. They provided additional money to him. He said he tried working in jobs there for a while and thought that was just terrible. He was spending time doing menial chores when he would rather be in the library and reading and doing useful things. And the family supported him in that. So he never had to work then. Yeah. He never really said just what he was interested in. He would always answer simply science, something, but it had to be scientific. But he did major in chemistry because it looked more interesting to him than the other subjects, but he was never really enthusiastic about it. So he graduated in 1919 with an excellent education with all sorts of skills, but he didn't know what to do. Now, many bright kids end up in that situation. So for the next 4 years, he described that he just hung around with a bunch of friends at home, spending all their time talking together, taking little jobs to get sort of pocket money and not going anywhere. He didn't know really what he wanted to do. But in 1923, he got serious. In 1920 to 22, Rabi had returned to Cornell to start a PhD in chemistry. In 1923, he switched to Columbia and discovered that part of chemistry that he likes is called physics. So this was a gradual awakening. One of the themes of his early discussions is the abominable state of physics in the United States. It really didn't exist. He knew something was wrong. He had learned German somehow or other meanwhile and was reading the German scientific journals. Now this was just in the crucial period when quantum mechanics was being developed. And everyone was confused and puzzled and excited by it. And he sensed that something was going on and he ought to know about it. What he did was to start a conversation group with a bunch of his classmates. And they met every Sunday from 11 to really dinner time to read the papers, discuss them with each other, argue about it, and see what they could learn. In 23, he switched to Columbia. One of the reasons for going there was that he had a romantic attraction to Helen Newmark. This was a young lady who was attending City College at the time and was very interested in art. To support himself at the university, he got an appointment at the City College tutoring. Tutoring was really a full-time job and they paid a full $800 a year for these endless hours. So that was his situation. And through these discussions with his friends, some are names you might know, Francis Bitter was among his colleagues. And another was Ralph Kronig, who became a very important professor of physics in the Netherlands. So these were very serious young people, and they seriously devoted themselves to physics, and then they seriously devoted themselves to social problems and Karl Marx and communism, and just had endless debates. I've emphasized this because this study group was terribly important in his development. No one at Columbia was reading the German journals. Most of them didn't read German, and it was too far away. They were very provincial faculty they had there. His study group was sort of an antidote to that. Nonetheless, he went on to get a PhD in chemistry in an experiment which he found to be very tedious. And then he discovered a totally different way to make these measurements, magnetic susceptibles of crystals, by a clever new technique which eliminated most of the dog work, which was grinding crystals to various angles and measuring their properties. And he got his thesis done reasonably promptly, had it published, and was furious that no one was reading it. And he concluded from that his thesis had been a waste of time. He was working on a problem that nobody was interested in. And this question of taste in science was a theme for the rest of his life. Anyway, in 1926, Rabi submitted his dissertation to the Physical Review. Columbia had a very curious and archaic custom. You had to provide the university with about 20 copies of your thesis. Now, the only way to get 20 copies of your thesis was to basically publish it in a journal. So he sent it off to the journal. They accepted it after a few months. But on the following day, he got married to Helen Newmark and made the decision that he couldn't stay at Columbia. Nobody knew what was going on. He had to go to Europe and find out for himself. In 1927, he got an appointment as a Barnard Fellow. How that worked, I don't know. Barnard is a women's school. So he was occupying the position that a woman might hold. On June 2nd, he resigned from his teaching position at City College because he couldn't go to Europe when he was an employee of the college. In July of 27, he sailed for Europe with Helen, coming about a month after. Now, that was an incredibly audacious thing to do. He had no contacts at all in Europe. He went without anyone knowing that he was coming. That wasn't that unusual in those days because communications were so poor that if you wanted to see a professor, the best way to see him was to go to the university and ask for him. And so Rabbi had a little list of people that were worth seeing. The stars were, and he went to Europe to work with a star. So they left in July and they arrived in September. Now, when they arrived, he went first to work with Arnold Sommerfeld, who I tell you about, in Munich. And then he learned that the major scientific physics meeting of the year was about to be held in England. It was a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. So he traveled from Munich to London to attend the meeting in September, came back after a couple of years couple of months, couple of weeks of, of an incredible experience. His head was really spinning. He was really very enthusiastic. So he returned to work with Sommerfeld, and then realized that Sommerfeld was not really with it. Sommerfeld was the greatest teacher of the time. His books on every aspect of physics were the textbooks used in the German universities and widely used elsewhere. He knew everything. He is credited with having invented what we now call the scientific seminar. He's also credited with having a 3-volume treatise on the motions of the gyroscope. What Sommerfeld had done, which he thought was fascinating, when Bohr published his theory of the Bohr atom, with the electrons going around in sort of classical orbits, he realized that relativity would somewhat change the dynamics of the atom, the energies of these orbits, and did a calculation and came up with a solution to a troublesome problem. In hydrogen, the ground state, well, now the first excited state, ground state is angular momentum 0. It's a straight line which just bounces off the origin. Angular momentum 1 has 3 possible states. The electron can go in a circle, or it can go in an ellipse. As long as the major diameters are the same, they would have the same energy. But if you apply relativity, there's a slight energy difference. And that gave rise to a feature which had been known for some time called the fine structure of hydrogen. And his theory correctly calculated the value of the fine structure of hydrogen. So he felt that he was a leader in the subject. In fact, he was the victim of a cruel coincidence. He got the right value, but his theory was all wrong. And he never really gave it up. So Rabi, none of this was really known at the time, but Rabi had the instinct to know that Munich was not where the new quantum mechanics was going to be. So he went to the Holy Citadel, Copenhagen, to work with Bohr. So the Rabis went to Copenhagen, they got lodgings. Rabi went to the Carlsberg Institute, Bohr's Institute, and knocked on the door. And in a while, the secretary came to open it, and he said, "I'm Rabi, and I'm here to work with Bohr." She said, "Very nice, very good, but he's not here right now. They've had a late summer this summer." That summer was the one where much of quantum mechanics was finally brought out in the open. Anyway, he was still off on vacation. She said, "Come in, and I'll give you a room to use till he arrives." And that's how things were in these days. These institutes were open. He got in. Rabi, Bohr eventually came, and he and Rabi talked. And after a few days, Bohr said that, "I'm sorry, my institute really is full," which was a huge disappointment to Rabi. He said, "But I have worked out something which I think you will enjoy." He said, "Wolfgang Pauli has an opening, and I've arranged for you to go to work with him in Frankfurt." Now, Wolfgang Pauli was already legendary, although he is still a young man. His first contribution to the quantum theory was that he invented the Pauli exclusion principle. Later, Pauli tended to be arrogant, and later on he was very angry that they named the exclusion principle after him. He said it really isn't important enough. Nonetheless, it answered a huge number of questions. So the Rabis moved to to Frankfurt, and Pauli actually was quite nice with him, which was unusual because he had the reputation of being harsh and brutal. And well, Vicky Weisskopf said Pauli was just totally honest, and he never hid his opinions. They got on very well together. Rabbi said that what happened was when he got there, his German wasn't that good. And when in a discussion with Pauli, he meant to say, I disagree, but what he really said was, that's nonsense. And Pauli stopped at that point, thought about it, and went on, and never gave him any trouble since then. He was the one person in the institute that he got on with. So they were working on the problem of the free electron moving under the Dirac theory, in an electric field, to see if there was something interesting there. They were making some progress, but Pauli said, look, you're here in Frankfurt. This is an interesting physics department. You ought to walk around and see what's going on. So Rabbi did just that. And he was walking by an experimental laboratory and sort of stuck his head in the door out of curiosity. Turned out that it was Otto Stern's laboratory, and they started talking together, and Rabbi got interested in what Stern was doing, and then would, stop in now and then to discuss things. And at one point, Rabbi came up with a suggestion for Stern's experiments, a suggestion dealing with the deflections of atoms and molecules in magnetic fields. And it turned out it was a very good suggestion. Stern said, well, why don't you do the experiment? Now, Rabbi was a theorist, not an experimenter, but he had enjoyed working with his hands and it sounded kind of interesting. So he went in to the laboratory and started working and did the experiment, and it turned out to be successful. Of course, Rabbi was absolutely elated by that. And in fact, what this experience did was turn Rabbi from a theorist to an experimenter, and his career started there. Yeah. So here's a thumbnail of Pauli. He was considered a Wunderkind, a wonder child, because when he was 19 years old, and relativity wasn't that old, he wrote a treatise on relativity. It was asked for by his boss then, who was Max Born. And Born had expected Pauli to assist him in writing the treatise, but Pauli wrote the whole thing, and it was a classic. It was published and is still in the literature. In the Handbuch de Physik still has Pauli's article in its original form there. So Rabbi knew what he was doing in jumping and working with Pauli. It was pure accident which got him into contact with Otto Stern. But Stern was a man of tremendous accomplishments himself. Otto Stern was Einstein's first assistant. When Einstein became a professor, his first professorship was in 1912. No, yes, it started in 1912 in Prague. And Otto Stern came from a prosperous family and could do whatever he wanted to do. And he wanted to do physics. And he went to Prague and he became very close to Einstein from about 1912 to 1914. They worked together on theories of statistical mechanics, the implications of the quantum theory for for thermodynamics, and they got on very well together. In 1914, Stern went to Frankfurt, and Einstein left also for, I think, for Zurich at the time. At Frankfurt, he got a junior position in the department where he could start working. And in a most remarkable development, he went to work on a subject which had shown really very little promise, but he didn't create it. It was called molecular beams. And a molecular beam is a stream of atoms or molecules moving in a high vacuum with a small source and collimating slits, so the particles kind of arrive in a beam. That had been first done around 1910 by a Frenchman called Junorier. But Junorier really did very little science with it. He showed that the particles moved in a straight line in the beam. We let the beam deposit on a surface and look at its shape, and you can see that they've all traveled straight ahead. And then if you increase the pressure, the trace disappears. And that's where he left it. Stern had the imagination to realize that this could be a very powerful tool for all sorts of new physics. And his first application with that is he designed experiments to measure the speeds of the atoms and molecules. The speeds were unknown. There was a theory for them, but the only thing known about the particles was their energy from kinetic theory. You know, if you heat them up, they get hotter, they move faster, but it doesn't tell you how individual atoms move. And he set about measuring them. And first thing he did in Frankfurt was to measure the speeds of atoms and molecules. It was a very fundamental experiment because it was the first time this had been done, or the assumptions of kinetic theory had been experimentally demonstrated at the microscopic level. However, it was the next experiment which really made him famous and is still known by every physics student, the Stern-Gerlach experiment. I've shown this slide before when I was talking about the origins of atomic clocks, but basically the atoms and molecules often have magnetic properties. And if you pass them through a magnetic field, they just fly straight ahead. But if the field is diverging in space, if it has a gradient to it, there will be a force in the direction of that gradient, depending on the orientation of the atom. What this experiment shows is a molecular beam, which was a theme in all of Stern's work, with a trace deposited at the end. Now, the trace should be smeared out because the atoms have all sorts of different orientations, but the data over here, and that was the original data, shows that they're deflected. Now here the deflections are up and down, and you can see that at the center, there are two separate beams. There's nothing in between. This means that the atoms can only be oriented in two directions. It was called spatial quantization. And this was staggering. It was the first direct evidence of a quantum property. The quantum ideas were in the air, but no one had been able to show something really quantum. And Rabi said while he was there, and he got there about 1926 or 7, there were still constant visitors to the laboratory who wanted to see for themselves because they thought it was unbelievable. And that that played a principal role in the developments which were then going on. Now, it was a terribly difficult experiment. Otto Stern himself was not a great experimenter, and he realized how difficult it would be. And so he enlisted a colleague, Walter Gerlach, who was a fabulous experimenter. And it was a fabulous experiment, not only because of the techniques, but more specifically because of the underlying concept of what he was going to measure. And this was just typical of the sort of things that Stern did. He got the Nobel Prize for that experiment in 1943. Rabi got the Nobel Prize the following year. But he did much more than that experiment. He did a series of what are really classic experiments. The first was a proof of spatial quantization. Goodness. Yeah. He discovered photon recoil, namely when an atom absorbs light, it gets a kick. A very difficult experiment to do, but it was done in his laboratory. He had very good people with him. This was done by Otto Frisch. They discovered the photon recoil. People didn't know much what to make of it. It was just kind of interesting until lasers were invented. And this is the basic process which allows the creation of ultra-cold atoms. So it was a crucial bit of understanding, even though it took half a century for it to be put to use, which is maybe a pretty good description of what good basic research does. He also discovered matter waves. Now, the de Broglie had postulated that electrons were described by wave packets. The question is a whole atom described by a wave packet? And Stern found that it was. He measured the magnetic moment of the proton, and it turned out not to be what Pauli predicted. Pauli told him not to bother with the experiment. It was very different. And that was the origin of the discovery of the strong force. There were interactions in the within the proton which did not obey the Dirac theory, namely they were not electromagnetic in origin. It was a new type of force. He also discovered the magnetic moment of the neutron. And he did that by comparing the magnetic moments of the hydrogen atom and the deuteron atom, or basically hydrogen and deuteron molecules. So he spent his career doing profound experiments, and this very much influenced Rabi, who was of that like to begin with. Okay. In the spring of the 29, Rabi starts out, he's been working with Otto Stern. He wants to see the other greats in Europe. And he does, he visits with Max Born, Erwin Schrödinger, Werner Heisenberg, with Frisch, with Hans Bethe, Peter Debye. And he also met a number of really excellent American physicists, Oppenheimer and Teller. A theme in all the discussions with the American physicists was how contemptuous the Germans were. They thought that American physics was a laugh. For instance, when the volumes of the Physical Review came to them, they came in one package because it was much cheaper. So they'd have someone save them all for the year and then ship a year's at once. And this is at a time when time was, fabulously important. They just dismissed the Americans altogether. And at that point, Rabi, with some of his friends, decided that they were going to make American physics great. It's rather ambitious, but they did it. Okay. At the end of his tour there in the spring of 1929, The money ran out, the fellowships had run out. He had to return to the United States. He had absolutely no job at all. There was some question about what would the Rabbis do when they got back. There were very few prospects for hiring a physicist in the United States at that time. For one reason, physics wasn't considered that important. And another real reason was that Rabi was Jewish. And anti-Semitism in the universities was very strong then. It may be lingering today, but nothing like that. So he knew he wasn't going to be able to get a job at a university. But on March 4th, he gets this telegram from Columbia offering him a position, a lectureship, sort of low man on the totem pole, for $3,000 a year. That must have been ecstatic for them. $3,000 a year in those days was good money, and this is a good position. The backstory to why Columbia made that decision was that the previous fall, Heisenberg made a lecture tour in the United States and stopped at Columbia. And the head of the department, George Pegram, said that they were desperate to bring quantum mechanics to Columbia. They needed someone from Europe. Who did he recommend? And Heisenberg recommended Rabi. He actually hadn't met Rabi by that point, but he knew Pauli and Bohr and others very well. And he formed his opinion secondhand, but he said, get Rabi. Well, it was very easy to get Rabi, so they got Rabi, and that worked out very well for Columbia. It worked out particularly well for the Rabis. Okay, now what Rabi learned in Europe. This statement, which I can't quite see because of these photographs. I'll let you read it while I'm monkeying with my machine. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. This idea of taste and insight as being the fundamentals of good science was very important to him. This is quoted from the biographical memoir that Norman Ramsey wrote for Rabi. But he said at other places too, he expressed these opinions to his students, and actually he expressed it to me in more or less those terms. It was sort of a credo for his life. As far as I know, Stern never devoted himself to a minor question. As far as I can tell, that's true, but it really isn't very good advice because it sort of narrows your focus. Einstein, for instance, worked on trivial questions. He worked on the meandering of rivers, and he worked with Szilard on the creation of a new type of refrigerator. So even Einstein, who is the paradigm of physics, could do some things which weren't, which were minor. Nonetheless, this is good if you can do it. Rabi pretty well did it. For example, when he proposed the atomic clock, his quotation was, "I'd like to see someone build such a clock to measure Einstein's predictions." When he said, "I'd like to measure it, I'd like someone to measure it," meant he didn't want to do it himself. Well, his research at Columbia, he set up a laboratory there from scratch. The first thing he did was theoretical rather than experimental, although it was an experimental lab he was aiming for. And gosh. Yeah, this is the first thing he did. This diagram is familiar to everyone who does atomic physics. It's the bright Rabi diagram. This is a diagram of the energy of a single electron atom, like the alkali atoms, in a magnetic field. The energy in the magnetic field depends on the magnetic moment of the atom. The atom is composed of a electron with a big electromagnetic moment and a proton with a small magnetic moment. And depending on how they're oriented, the energy varies with the field. If they point along the field, they have an extreme energy, these straight lines. But there are states in which they are anti-parallel, in which case their magnetic moments tend to diverge. And by measuring the energies of the molecule, you can determine what the spin of the molecule or atom is and what its nuclear magnetic moment is. Now, these are very important for nuclear physics. And in fact, the motivation for most of Stern's work was nuclear physics rather than atomic physics. And atomic physics grew out of nuclear physics. This diagram here, which is standard throughout the field, started with Rabi and Bright working together in 1931. Rabi was starting to build his experimental group and experimental laboratory. It took a couple of years to get going, but then they went at high speed. They spent a couple of years measuring magnetic moments and spins. And then Rabi got a revolutionary idea. It grew out of the bright Rabi diagram and knowing very well what you wanted to measure. Here is an apparatus like Stern's original apparatus, except the atoms go through two fields over here with gradients. One deflects the atoms up and the other deflects the atoms down. And if you design it properly, they will arrive at the detector even if their speeds are different, because the amount of deflection depends how long they spend there. In the center is this region over here. This is called an A magnet, historically B magnet, and this is the C magnet. And if the orientation of the atom should change as it goes through here, it will no longer get to the detector. It'll go off in some other direction like that. This means you could go to this diagram, and if you know what the magnetic field is, you know the separation of these levels, and you could start with an atom in that level and make it into this level. If you start with an atom in this level over here, which you go through both magnets, and you put it in that level over there, it won't get through. And if you know exactly the frequency in the magnetic field, then you know just about everything you need to know about the atom. Furthermore, you could know it with very, very high accuracy. So they put that to work and turned out a series of papers where in a very short time, they measured the spins and moments of more than half a dozen atoms, work which previously would have taken years. They also made a huge discovery then. They discovered that the deuteron was not round, it was not spherical, that the deuteron has a magnetic moment, and that took has a quadrupole moment. And that took the theoretical community by storm. Within a year, there were about 10 different theories to explain it. The discovery was made in 1935. In 1940, the work came to a halt. And that's because of the war breaking out, not in the United States, but in Great Britain. The situation was absolutely crucial. And it was the Brits had a crude radar system to warn of coming planes, but it was realized that radar could do much, much better than that, and that it would be a very powerful defense tool. I don't go through the history of this, it's pretty well documented, but in November of 1939, a laboratory was created to develop radar, the MIT Radiation Laboratory. It was sort of called into existence at the beginning of November of that year. At the end of the month, Rabi just moved to Cambridge, left the laboratory, left his research work, and didn't return for 5 years. Say he was very purposeful, and when he did something, he did it with great deliberation and enthusiasm. Now, the story of the Rad Lab, well, that has been documented many places. Rabi's position there was as the director of scientific research. It was a development laboratory, but he was in charge of the scientific aspects of it. And that's just what he should have done, because he had this incredible knowledge of people's capacities and goals. He had a fabulous judgment. That fabulous judgment turned American physics from second place to first place during the war. And it turned Columbia from a second-rate university in physics to a leading university in physics. And it was all because he knew how to choose people. At the Rad Lab, well, Ed Purcell was there. Ed Land, no, not Ed Land. Bob Dickey from Princeton was there. Julian Schringer was there doing the theory of microwave networks. I mean, these were both Nobel Prize winners later, and he got to them early and got them there. He got to Norman Ramsey early too. Actually, Ramsey was driving out to his first position at the University of Illinois, and during the trip, Rabi got to him by phone, and Ramsey just turned around and went back to Cambridge. And he worked at the lab for several years, and then he went on to work at Los Alamos. Anyway, the development of radar was a fantastic success. It was immediately taken up by the Navy. They just loved it. The Air Force was a tougher nut to crack, but they did develop airborne radar, and by the end of the war, the Air Force realized that radar was essential for planes also. The development of the radar for planes was in the area of the 3-centimeter radiation project they had there. The 3-centimeter radiation project was headed by Norman Ramsey. And when Stennis, the Secretary of War, learned that the Air Force was not enthusiastic about introducing radar, he told Rabi to do something about it. He had to fix the problem. And he fixed the problem by giving it to Norman Ramsey. And Ramsey fixed the problem by going to Washington, sitting down with some of the Air Force people, and on the spot, developing a plan for radar for the Air Force. That was a big plan. He said that the two of us, well, actually there were 3 of them, sat down together for a weekend and came up with a budget of a couple of $1 billion. Now, $1 billion is very big bucks, no matter what time scale you're looking on, but to figure out how you can spend that money and what you should do in a very short time was, in a sense, sheer genius. It didn't hurt that Ramsey's father had been a procurement officer in the US Army, and Ramsey knew all of the language of procurement. Anyway, the Air Force succeeded, the Magna lab succeeded, and of course, the United States succeeded. during the war, Rabi stuck at the rad lab, although lots of other people wanted him. But someone who wanted him particularly was Oppenheimer. Rabi and Oppenheimer were good friends since the European days. And Oppenheimer was aware of Rabi's skill in choosing people. He tried to get Rabi to come to Los Alamos, but Rabi wouldn't go. But he said he would visit as an informal advisor, and he played that role. He was careful not to get on any committees at all. He never had clearance, for instance. But he visited Oppenheimer fairly regularly and discussed really personnel and personalities. So when the war ended, there was a quick rush back to laboratories. The rad laboratory was essentially emptied within a few months. Rabi realized that a huge amount of information and technical reports had been developed and that they should be preserved. And so he launched this project of writing the Rad Lab series. I imagine most people who are working in microwaves are familiar with it. He paid some people to stay on just to finish writing their books. One of the people who stayed on was Ed Purcell. Purcell was a faculty member at Harvard, but Rabi convinced him to stay on, and he was a co-author on one of the most important volumes. It was during that period, that couple of years after the war's end, that Purcell invented nuclear magnetic resonance. He did it in the evenings because he did not want to, misuse his position at the Rad Lab. But he was thoroughly familiar with Rabi's ideas of resonance, and from that developed nuclear magnetic resonance. From that developed magnetic resonance imaging and many other things. Schwinger went on very rapidly to become a prime mover in the new physics of quantum electrodynamics, but he's one person that Rabi had foreseen. So in the following years, well, there was some question about whether he should return to Columbia University. He could have any job in the country that he wanted. The department chair who had first invited him, George Pegram, was wildly enthusiastic about getting him back. And Rabi made a deal with him. It seems like an extraordinary deal. He said, I'll come back if you make me the department chairman. Department head. Why that's extraordinary? Well, most department heads kind of enjoy it one way or another. Pegram actually at that point had been for a while and was ready to step aside. It was wild for Rabi because he didn't like management positions, but he wanted to make good on his ideas of raising the quality of the university. And the way you raise the quality of the university is you just appoint stellar people. And he did that. He appointed a faculty which was incredible. Let me show you now. Yes, this works here. This is a list of faculty members at Columbia that Rabi had appointed and who got Nobel Prizes for, most of them, the majority anyway, got Nobel Prizes for works they actually did at Columbia. Now, it's one thing to bring someone in who is advanced in their career and a good candidate for being a Nobel Prize, but Rabi could spot these people when they were young. One of the names which is very conspicuous is Charlie Towns. He invented the laser while at Columbia. Norman Ramsey, well, his work was based on Towns and Rabi's work, but the actual inventions for which he was cited were done after he left the place. But here are, I think there are 8 Nobel laureates whom Rabi had spotted as good candidates for great work in the future and good people to have on the faculty, and he got them. So he was sort of the godfather of physics at Columbia. And with this type of faculty, Columbia's reputation really did soar. At the same time, Europe's reputation sunk because the country had been devastated by the war. There were good people there. The country did recover very slowly. And now it's essentially on a par with Europe and the United States. Right after the war, Rabi undertook to rectify what he felt was an injustice. Namely, when the war was finished, Berkeley had its own separate laboratories had been set up. Not the Rad Lab, but there was an atomic weapons lab that had been set up there. In Chicago, well, they'd gotten Fermi. He left during the war and didn't come back. And they built argon and a reactor. Rabi knew that the future of the physics was going to require big facilities and large machines, and there was no place this could be put on the East. So he proposed that the federal government establish a laboratory somewhere east, which means, of course, somewhere close to New York City. As those plans were underway, Zacharias, who was at MIT, got wind of it. And he got some of his colleagues to come in and start a counter proposal. They thought that Fort Devens, which isn't that far from Cambridge, would be a splendid place for such a laboratory. And then other universities got wind of it too. Yale wanted access to the place. Columbia, of course, wanted access. Cornell came in and wanted access. And some of the university, Princeton too. They all wanted to be with basically in somewhere near this large new laboratory. The questions about siting it became critical because they had a deadline in which the window was open for financing it. And there was just squabbling on the siting committee. Rabi again made a great choice. He got Norman Ramsey to head that committee. And Ramsey is very good at getting people to work together. And the result of that was they made a compromise on where to put it. They put it in Camp, I think Yahoo, in what's now Brookhaven, Long Island. It used to be a large military base which had been abandoned. And
yep, Hank.
Yep, Hank, yes, thank you. Ramsey said that the solution to the dilemma was to get a place that nobody liked. It's equally far from everyone. It's a hard place to get to, but it's there. And of course, it has played a very large role in American science ever since. And that was all triggered by Rabi. Another machine which was essentially triggered by Rabi was CERN. CERN is a European development. America isn't officially part of CERN, but it developed around 1957 to 58. There was a meeting of foreign physicists in the United States to discuss what they could do to recover. They were so far out of physics that they felt it would be impossible ever to compete with America. And they invited Rabi to the meeting, or maybe he invited himself. But anyway, as I got this from Ramsey, after listening to the sessions, every nation complaining what they didn't have the resources to do anything like this. And Rabi got up and said in his tactful fashion, "You guys ought to stop whining and do something. If you collaborate together, you can do it." And he bawled them out. He really was rather rude to them, but it made an impression. And that triggered the creation of CERN. So that's another feather in his cap. He played many roles in the government. For instance, right after the war, it was realized that you needed some institution for dealing with nuclear energy and bombs. And a proposal was put up for a committee that reported directly to the president. It's called the May-Johnson Bill. Rabi, who could read very astutely, in reading it, knew that if their plan went through, it would be dominated by the military, that the nuclear issues would be under military control. And he knew that that was impossible. And he took a leadership role in getting that bill defeated. Instead of that, the Atomic Energy Commission, and later became the Department of Energy, was set up as an independent department. So he changed the nuclear strategy of the United States. And that was, well, there were others involved, but he played a leading role in that. He became the American delegate to UNESCO on scientific affairs. So he was widely consulted, widely involved. And I'm sorry that I don't have more pictures of him, but I do have one picture that I can show over here. Yep. It's called the Rabi tree. It was created at the time of his retirement, really by it was called for by the Office of Naval Research, and it was put together by the A.D. Little Company. And it shows all the work which has grown out of Rabi. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to see the names on here, but you can see what look like leaves and snowflakes on the street are separate groups who can trace their origin back to Rabi. You know, that the laser is on there, magnetic resonance is on there, nuclear laboratories are on there. It was really a fabulous tree. One of these major roots at the bottom over here is labeled Otto Stern. So they did their homework fairly carefully. But I think this is evidence that calling Rabi's career fabulous is justified. Well, I'm sorry I have these gimmicks, these problems with his system. And I had also hoped to show some more visual things, but my system was having a nervous breakdown. So
ignoring your system for just a minute, Dan,
yeah,
we've got about 10 minutes left.
yeah.
And Robbie isn't close to dying yet. So I don't know how much more material you've got. We've got a couple of options. One is that you just continue until you're done and people stick around as long as they choose to stick around. Another option is that you find a convenient place to stop and we take whatever is left and put it in a subsequent day. What do you think makes sense?
Let me try to stop here, but leave a few minutes for chat. I'd like to just tell one quick anecdote. When I was quite young, but I had gotten my PhD, I went to a conference. It was held at Heidelberg, and Rabi was there, and I gave a paper on, I talked about the work I had done. Afterwards, we went out for lunch in a restaurant on Philosophenweg, which I thought was a wonderful name and stuff. And Rabi sat across the table from me, and he said at one point, you know, Kleppner, what you did was really quite interesting. And he went on and explained what I had done quite well, but he left out some important things that I had said also. And I said, that's quite right. And in addition, I started telling him some other things, and he looked at me and he shook his head and he said, be quiet and listen to a master. So that requires no response, but he could be abrasive like that. He was known at Columbia. He would stop a student and ask him what he's doing and said, why are you doing that? So he was very forthright. Later, he became, in his final years, I got to know him quite well, visiting him in New York. One day, a visit had to be postponed because he had a procedure. So when I saw him next time, I said, I hope your procedure went well. And he looked at me and said, no man ever died a hero for anything below the waist. So he was a very tough guy, but a very wise guy. Anyway, I'll stop now, and if people do have questions.
Can I just make a, I found what you had to say about building up American physics interesting, because it's very clear that's the atomic physicist's view of what built up American physics. The nuclear physicists have a slightly different view of building up American physics.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, and furthermore, I think both groups have to acknowledge that the presidents of major institutions, Compton at MIT and Millikan at Caltech, and I don't know who was president at Chicago, already in the 30s were saying we have to start becoming serious research institutions. I mean, there was more going on than Rabi, and there was more going on than E.O. Lawrence or people like that.
Well, you're certainly quite correct about that, but I think what Rabi did at Columbia is really fantastic. Much of that was nuclear and particle physics Nobel Prizes that they got, along with the atomic Nobel Prizes. So
True.
That's why I talked at the beginning about hype and such. I gave my resources. None of my resources gave the story like you were doing. Probably Daniel Kevlis would be a much better person on that subject.
True.
But
yes, and I would also add, just you said he and Zacharias. What was it? You use a kind of, he was aware of Zacharias or something like that. Whereas I know that John King said that Zacharias and Rabi talked at least once a week over all the years that Zacharias was at MIT and Rabi was alive.
Yeah. No, I'm sure that it's not surprising that Zach learned what was going on and decided he better do something to interfere with these New Yorkers. Yeah.
Well, he wanted to be one,
Of course,
but he
when Zach
couldn't get.
came to MIT, Zach himself was coming from Rabi's lab. He associated himself with the new research laboratory for electronics, and he helped plan the laboratory for electronics, but he was a member of the nuclear physics division in the physics department. Yep, the history of physics is quite interesting.